My name is Liam Mitchell, though most people call me Alex. At 26, I never expected to find myself caught in the middle of what could only be described as a modern-day Romeo and Juliet story, minus Juliet, plus another Romeo, and with corporate politics replacing family feuds. I worked as a financial analyst at Barrett International, one of the largest investment firms in Boston. The pay was good, the hours were long, and my life followed a predictable pattern until that autumn morning when everything changed. That was the day I first met Lucas Barrett III, Will, as he preferred to be called, the only son of our company's chairman, Jonathan Barrett. The first time I saw Will was during our annual corporate review meeting. While everyone else wore standard dark suits and conservative ties, he walked in wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit with a burgundy turtleneck that seemed to defy corporate conventions while still looking more sophisticated than anyone else in the room. His dark brown hair was styled in that effortlessly messy way that probably took an hour to perfect, and his green eyes carried a hint of mischief that made him stand out in a room full of serious faces. I remember thinking how different he was from what I'd expected. The rumors about the chairman's son painted him as a spoiled, trust fund kid who spent more time on yachts than in boardrooms. But as he began presenting in the company's new digital transformation strategy, it became clear that Will was sharp, articulate, and surprisingly down-to-earth. Our first real interaction happened 3 days later in the office kitchen. I was brewing my third cup of coffee when he walked in, looking slightly less polished than during the meeting, with his sleeves rolled up and tie loosened. "Please tell me there's enough for another cup," he said, gesturing to the coffee pot I was holding. "Just finished brewing," I replied, reaching for an extra mug from the cabinet. "Cream? Sugar?" "Black is fine, thanks." He took the mug, our fingers brushing briefly. "You're Liam Mitchell, right? From the financial analysis team?" I was surprised he knew my name. "Alex," I corrected automatically. "Only my mother calls me Liam, and only when she's angry." He laughed, and it was a genuine sound that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Well, Alex, I actually wanted to talk to you about your analysis of our Asian market expansion. Those projections you included in last week's report, they were impressive, much more detailed than what we usually see." We ended up talking for almost an hour, long after our coffee had gone cold. Will had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room, even when you were just discussing market trends and financial projections. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers, occasionally running his hand through his hair in a gesture I would come to recognize as a sign of deep concentration. As days turned into weeks, we found more reasons to interact. What started as casual coffee breaks turned into working lunches. Will would stop by my desk with questions about reports that probably could have been answered by anyone on my team. I found myself looking forward to these moments, even while trying to convince myself that I was imagining the lingering glances and the way his hand would sometimes rest on my shoulder while looking at my computer screen. The problem wasn't just that he was the chairman's son, though that alone was complicated enough. It was that I had spent years carefully separating my personal life from my professional one. Being gay in the corporate world wasn't the career-ending revelation it used to be, but it wasn't something I advertised either. I had worked too hard to get where I was to risk it all for what could only be a complicated entanglement. But Will had a way of making all my carefully constructed walls seem paper-thin. The turning point came during a late October evening. Most of the office had cleared out, but I was still at my desk, analyzing data for an upcoming presentation. The floor was quiet except for the gentle hum of my computer and the occasional ping of the elevator. "You know, most people have gone home by now." Will's voice startled me from my concentration. He was leaning against my cubicle wall, his tie gone and top buttons undone. "It's almost 9. "Just trying to finish this presentation for tomorrow," I said, rubbing my tired eyes. "The Singapore expansion project." He moved closer, peering at my screen. "Have dinner with me. We can discuss it over something better than vending machine coffee." I hesitated, aware of how this might look. "Will—" "Just dinner, Alex. 2 colleagues, discussing work." But the way he said it, with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, suggested he knew it wasn't that simple. We ended up at a small Italian restaurant in Back Bay, tucked away from the main street. It was the kind of place that had tablecloths and candlelight, but wasn't pretentious about it. Will ordered a bottle of wine, and somewhere between the antipasti and main course, our conversation drifted far from work. "So why finance?" he asked, swirling the red wine in his glass. "You don't strike me as someone who dreamed of spreadsheets as a child." I laughed. "Actually, I wanted to be a writer, but my father was a banker, and practicality won out." "What about you? Was joining Barrett International always the plan?" "The expected plan," he corrected, his expression growing more serious. "Father had my whole life mapped out before I could walk. Barrett Prep School, Yale, MBA from Harvard, then straight into the family business." He paused, taking a sip of wine. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen differently." "What would you have chosen?" "Architecture," he said without hesitation. "I love the idea of creating spaces that affect how people live, how they interact. Instead, I'm managing other people's money." The vulnerability in his voice made something shift between us. This wasn't just the chairman's son anymore. This was someone who understood what it meant to live under expectations. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked softly. "Sometimes, but then I think about the good we can do with this position. The philanthropic initiatives, the sustainable investment projects." He leaned forward slightly. "Speaking of which, there's an environmental technology conference in New York next weekend. Father wants me to attend. I could use someone with your analytical skills to help evaluate potential investments." My heart rate quickened. "Are you asking me to go to New York with you?" "Professionally speaking, yes." His green eyes held mine. "But I wouldn't mind getting to know you otherwise, outside of work either." The moment hung between us, heavy with possibility and danger. I knew I should say no. This could complicate everything, my career, my carefully organized life, but something in the way he looked at me made all those concerns seem distant. "What time does the conference start?" I heard myself ask. The smile that spread across his face made my heart skip. "I'll have my assistant send you the details." The next week was a blur of preparation and anticipation. I told myself I was just being thorough when I packed and repacked my suitcase 3 times, when I spent an hour deciding which ties to bring, when I researched every company that would be at the conference.
Flight to New York was short, but sitting next to Will in first class, his insistence made me acutely aware of every minute. He spent most of the time reviewing conference materials, occasionally asking for my opinion, his shoulder brushing against mine whenever he leaned over to show me something. The hotel was exactly what you'd expect for someone with the Barrett name, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Will had booked us connecting rooms for convenience, he said, though the look in his eyes suggested other possibilities. That first evening in New York would change everything. That evening in New York started innocently enough. After checking in, Will suggested we review our conference schedule over drinks in the hotel's rooftop bar. The Manhattan skyline sparkled behind the floor-to-ceiling window, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. "Beautiful view," I commented, trying to focus on the city lights, rather than how Will looked in the soft ambient lighting. "It is," he agreed. But when I turned, I found him looking at me instead of the skyline. The intensity in his eyes made my breath catch. We discussed the conference agenda, but the conversation kept drifting to more personal topics. Will told me about growing up under the weight of the Barrett name, about his mother who passed away when he was 12, about the pressure of being the sole heir to a financial empire. I shared stories about my own family, my supportive but traditional parents in Connecticut, my younger sister, who was the only person who truly knew me. "Have you told them?" Will asked, quietly, understanding immediately what I meant about my sister knowing me. "Your parents." I shook my head. It never seemed like the right time. "What about you? Does your father know that I'm gay?" Will smiled. "Rue, I think he suspects, but we maintain this unspoken agreement not to discuss it. The Barrett legacy is everything to him, continuing the family line, maintaining appearances." The vulnerability in his voice made me reach out instinctively, placing my hand over his on the table. He turned his palm upward, intertwining our fingers, and suddenly the air between us felt charged with electricity. "We should probably head back," I suggested, though everything in me wanted to stay in that moment. "Early start tomorrow." We nodded, but didn't let go of my hand until we reached the elevator. The ride up was silent, filled with unspoken tension. When we reached our floor, he followed me to my room. "Alex," he said softly, as I fumbled with my keycard, "I know this is complicated. The company, my father, everything. but I can't pretend I don't feel something here. I turned to face him, finding him closer than I expected. Will, we should think this through. If anyone at work found out, he cut me off by stepping forward, his hand coming up to cut my cheek. For once in my life, I don't want to think. I just want to feel. The kiss when it came was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. But when I responded, pulling him closer, it deepened into something more urgent, more desperate. We stumbled into my room, the door clicking shut behind us. That night changed everything. We talked for hours, sharing hopes, fears, and dreams. Between kisses, Will confessed that he'd noticed me long before the coffee kitchen encounter, that he'd specifically requested my financial reports because he wanted an excuse to talk to me. I admitted that I'd been fighting my attraction to him since that first meeting. Morning found us tangled in hotel sheets, the dawn painting the room in soft blues and grays. Will was tracing patterns on my shoulder when his phone buzzed, his father requesting his presence at a pre-conference breakfast meeting. Reality calls, he sighed, pressing a kiss to my temple before reluctantly getting up. The conference itself passed in a blur of presentations and networking, stolen glances across crowded rooms, and brief touches when no one was looking. In public, we maintained professional distance, but our evenings were filled with room service dinners, shared confidences, and an increasing certainty that what we had was more than just a weekend affair. The complications of our situation became apparent as soon as we returned to Boston. At work, we had to pretend nothing had changed, but everything had. Every executive meeting became an exercise in self-control. Every casual interaction had to be carefully measured to avoid suspicion. We developed a system of subtle signals and excuses for spending time together. Work dinners, project consultations, and weekend conferences became our cover stories. Will would send me emails with hidden meanings between the lines of professional correspondence. I learned to decipher his business-like requests for market analyses as invitations for private moments. But keeping secrets in a corporate environment is like trying to hold water in cued hands. Eventually, something slips through. The first crack in our carefully constructed facade appeared 3 months into our relationship. We were at a charity gala hosted by Barrett International, one of those black tie events where the city's elite gathered to network and show off their philanthropy. Will was seated at the main table with his father and the board members, while I was with the other executives and senior managers. Throughout the evening, I caught him looking at me with an intensity that made my collar feel too tight. During his speech about the company's charitable initiatives, he kept glancing in my direction, his words about following your heart and staying true to yourself carrying double meaning that only I understood. Margaret Chen, our shrewd head of marketing, noticed. I caught her watching us with calculating eyes, her expression thoughtful as she observed our subtle interactions. Later that evening, she cornered me at the bar. "You know," she said casually, swirling her martini, "William seems different lately, happier, more focused." She paused, studying my reaction. "It's interesting how often you two work late together." In a blur of presentations and networking, stolen glances across crowded rooms, and brief touches when no one was looking. In public, we maintained professional distance, but our evenings were filled with room service dinners, shared confidences, and an increasing certainty that what we had was more than just a weekend affair. The complications of our situation became apparent as soon as we returned to Boston. At work, we had to pretend nothing had changed, but everything had. Every executive meeting became an exercise in self-control. Every casual interaction had to be carefully measured to avoid suspicion. We developed a system of subtle signals and excuses for spending time together. Work dinners, project consultations, and weekend conferences became our cover stories. Will would send me emails with hidden meanings between the lines of professional correspondence. I learned to decipher his business-like requests for market analyses as invitations for private moments. But keeping secrets in a corporate environment is like holding water in cupped hands. Eventually, something slips through. The first crack in our carefully constructed facade appeared 3 months into our relationship. We were at a charity gala hosted by Barrett International, one of those black tie events where the city's elite gathered to network and show off their philanthropy.
Will was seated at the main table with his father and the board members, while I was with the other executives and senior managers. Throughout the evening, I caught him looking at me with an intensity that made my collar feel too tight. During his speech about the company's charitable initiatives, he kept glancing in my direction, his words about following your heart and staying true to yourself carrying double meaning that only I understood. Margaret Chen, our shrewd head of marketing, noticed. I caught her watching us with calculating eyes, her expression thoughtful as she observed our subtle interactions. Later that evening, she cornered me at the bar. "You know, William seems different lately," she said casually, swirling her martini. "Happier, more focused." She paused, studying my reaction. "It's interesting how often you two work late together." My heart raced, but years of professional training kept my expression neutral. "The Singapore expansion requires a lot of attention," I replied evenly. She smiled knowingly but said nothing more. However, the interaction left me unsettled, and when I told Will about it later that night at his penthouse apartment, he grew serious. "Maybe we should be more careful," he said, pacing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. "Or maybe—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of anxiety. "Maybe what?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "Maybe we should stop hiding." He turned to face me, his expression determined. "I'm tired of pretending, Alex. I'm tired of watching what I say, how I look at you, who might notice if I stand too close. Will, your father." "I know," he interrupted, sitting beside me on the leather couch. "I know it could affect the company, the shareholders, everything. But I'm 30 years old. I've spent my entire life trying to be what everyone else wanted. For once, I want to choose my own path." He took my hand, and I could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. "I love you, Alex. I think I have since that first day in the coffee kitchen. It was the first time either of us had said those words. They hung in the air between us, beautiful and terrifying in their implications. I love you too," I whispered, because it was true, and because in that moment nothing else seemed to matter. The next few weeks were a dance on the edge of a knife. We were more careful at work, but in private we began making plans. Will started having subtle conversations with trusted board members, testing the waters about modernizing the company's image. I began putting out feelers for other job opportunities just in case things went badly. But fate has a way of derailing even the most careful plans. The catalyst came in the form of a corporate espionage scandal that rocked Barrett International. A competitor had somehow obtained confidential information about our Asian expansion strategy. As head of the project, I was among those called in for questioning. During one particularly intense meeting with the internal investigation team, someone mentioned seeing me access the secure servers late at night. What they didn't know was that those nights were spent with Will, working on legitimate project details between stolen kisses and takeout dinner. The investigation put us under a microscope, and suddenly our careful excuses for spending time together began to unravel. Rumors started circulating. Whispers followed us through the corridors. Even Jonathan Barrett, usually absorbed in high-level strategy, began paying more attention to his son's daily activities. The breaking point came during a board meeting where the leak investigation was being discussed. One of the board members suggested installing surveillance cameras in all working areas, including private offices. Will, sitting next to his father, visibly tensed. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice steady but strained. "I can explain the late-night server access." I felt my blood run cold as he stood up. 20 pairs of eyes turned to him, including his father's steely gaze. "William," Jonathan Barrett's voice held a warning, as if he suddenly realized what his son was about to do. Will looked at me, briefly, his eyes asking a silent question. I gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. "Father, members of the board," Will began, his voice gaining strength. "Alex Mitchell has been accessing those servers under my authorization. We've been working together on the Asian expansion project, among other things." He paused, taking a deep breath. But that's not the whole truth. The boardroom was silent enough to hear a pin drop. I could see Jonathan Barrett's knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of his chair.
Alex and I are in a relationship, Will continued. We have been for several months. The late-night access to company servers was legitimate work. But yes, we were working together because we wanted to spend time together. If anyone should be questioned about security breaches, it should be me, not him. The silence that followed was deafening. Jonathan Barrett slowly stood up, his face a mask of controlled fury. We'll discuss this in private, he said through clenched teeth. Meeting adjourned. As the board members filed out, some avoiding eye contact, others shooting curious glances our way, I remained seated. Will's father turned to me. Mr. Mitchell, I believe you should leave. No, Will said firmly. If we're having this
conversation, Alex stays HEK part of this. What followed was the most intense hour of my life. Jonathan Barrett paced the boardroom like a caged lion, alternating between cold fury and calculated reasoning. He talked about family legacy, about shareholder confidence, about the conservative nature of our major clients. "Have you completely lost your mind?" he demanded of Will. "Do you have any idea what this could do to the company, to our reputation?" "Times have changed, Father," Will argued. "Many of our competitors have openly LGBTQ+ executives. It hasn't affected their business." "This isn't about that." Jonathan slammed his hand on the table. "This is about you carrying on a secret relationship with a subordinate. Do you have any idea of the legal implications, the potential conflicts of interest?" "I'm willing to step down from my position," I offered quietly. Both men turned to look at me. "No," Will said immediately. "You've done nothing wrong. You're one of our best analysts." "He's right," Jonathan said unexpectedly. "Your work has been exemplary, Mr. Mitchell, which makes this situation even more complicated." He sat down heavily, suddenly looking older. "Lucas, you're my only son. Everything I've done to secure your future, the company's future." "I know, Father," Will's voice softened, "but my future has to be my choice. I love Alex. That's not going to change whether it's public knowledge or not." Jonathan Barrett studied us both for a long moment. "You're certain about this?" "More certain than I've ever been about anything," Will replied. His father nodded slowly. "Then we need to handle this correctly." He pressed the intercom button. "Margaret, please come in." To my surprise, Margaret Chen entered immediately, as if she'd been waiting outside. She didn't look surprised by the situation at all. "I assume you've already figured this out?" Jonathan said to her. She smiled slightly. "I had my suspicions. I've also been preparing contingency plans should they be needed." "Always thinking ahead," Jonathan muttered. "Fine. We'll need a strategy. Public relations, human resources, legal considerations." He looked at Will. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. No scandals, no leaks, no tabloid stories. We control the narrative." Over the next 2 hours, a plan took shape. I would be transferred to a different department, reporting to the board directly rather than through Will's chain of command. Our relationship would be disclosed to HR and the ethics committee. Margaret would prepare a carefully worded press release focusing on Barrett International's commitment to diversity and inclusion. "And Lucas," his father added, as we were wrapping up, "your mother would have been proud of your courage today. I haven't always been understanding, but she would have known exactly how to handle this." Will's eyes glistened at the mention of his mother. It was the first time I'd seen his father speak of her. As we left the boardroom, emotionally exhausted but relieved, Will squeezed my hand. "Thank you for staying," he whispered. "Always," I replied. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, policy changes, and carefully orchestrated public relations. The story broke in the financial press, but Margaret's skilled handling kept it focused on Barrett International's progressive leadership rather than any hint of scandal. The media coverage was surprisingly positive, thanks to Margaret's masterful handling. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece titled "Barrett International Leads Wave of Corporate Culture Change," while Forbes featured Will in their 40 Under 40 list, praising his bold leadership in bringing transparency and authenticity to the traditionally conservative financial sector. Of course, not everything was smooth sailing. Some conservative clients threatened to pull their investment, but for every account we risked losing, 2 new progressive investors showed interest. Jonathan Barrett, ever the strategist, began to see the business advantages of our situation. The company's image was transforming from an old-guard financial institution to a modern, inclusive corporation. Will and I moved in together 6 months after our relationship became public. We found a brownstone in Beacon Hill, perfectly situated between modern and traditional, just like our lives had become. The housewarming party was an interesting mix. My family, who had finally learned the truth and were making efforts to understand, Will's father, who brought an absurdly expensive bottle of wine and actually smiled more than once, and our closest friends from work, including Margaret, who had become our strongest ally. "You know, Will," said one evening as we sat on our rooftop terrace watching the sunset over the Charles, "I never thought it would turn out like this. I expected disaster when we came out." I leaned into him, remembering those tense early days. "Your father surprised everyone." "He's still adjusting," Will chuckled, "but yesterday he actually asked if I was coming to the family Christmas gathering in Vermont. Pretty sure that's progress." The company had changed too. Our story had somehow opened the floodgates. Other employees began feeling more comfortable being open about their lives. Barrett International established an LGBT+ employee resource group with Will as its executive sponsor. We implemented new diversity and inclusion policies, and our hiring practices became more progressive. 1 year after our boardroom confession, Jonathan Barrett announced his partial retirement while maintaining his position as chairman of the board. He handed over the CEO position to Will. The announcement came during the company's annual charity gala, the same event where Margaret had first confronted me about our relationship. "Barrett International has always been about legacy," Jonathan said in his speech. "But legacy isn't just about maintaining tradition. It's about growing, evolving, and becoming better. My son has taught me that." He turned to Will. "You've shown me that strength comes in many forms, and leadership means having the courage to be yourself." I watched from my seat as Will took the podium, looking confident and completely at ease. He spoke about the company's future, about combining traditional values with progressive thinking. His eyes found mine in the crowd as he talked about the importance of authenticity in leadership. Later that night, after the celebrations had wound down, we walked hand in hand through the public garden. The spring air was crisp, and the trees were just beginning to bloom. "I have something to ask you," Will said, stopping by the bridge over the lagoon. My heart skipped a beat as he reached into his pocket and dropped to a knee. "Liam Mitchell," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you've helped me become who I was always meant to be. You gave me the courage to live truthfully. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, platinum, elegant, but understated, just like our relationship had become. Tears blurred my vision as I pulled him up into a kiss. "Is that a yes?" He laughed against my lips. "Yes," I whispered, 1,000 times yes. Our wedding was held the following spring in the garden of the Barrett family estate. Jonathan Barrett stood proudly as Will's best man, while my sister served as my attendant. Margaret insisted on handling all the press coverage herself, ensuring our private moment wasn't overshadowed by business news. As I stand here now, watching Will chat with my parents at our reception, I think about that first morning in the office kitchen, when a simple cup of coffee changed my life. Love stories don't always follow the expected path. Sometimes they lead you through boardrooms and business meetings, through family traditions and corporate politics. But when they're real, when they're true, they have the power to change not just 2 people, but everyone around them. Will catches my eye across the garden and smiles that same smile that made me fall in love with him in the first place. And I know that while our story might not be conventional, it's ours, and it's perfect in its own way. The Barrett legacy continues, but it's different now. It's about more than just financial success. It's about authenticity, courage, and the power of being true to yourself. And as Will takes my hand under the spring sunset, I know that some risks are worth taking, some battles worth fighting, and some loves worth changing the world for.